We are living through the brief but memorable era of the coronavirus. This video is recorded on April 3rd, 2020, at a time when the people of France have been deprived of such basic civil liberties as the right to walk in the park. And the peculiar truth is that for some people, it would be completely harmless to take a walk in the park. People like myself, for example, who already had the coronavirus and have already completely recovered from it, who can neither transmit it to other people nor are they at risk of transmitting it themselves. So you have a complex question here of civil liberties, constitutionality, why these concepts exist if we can't actually exercise these civil rights the moment it becomes inconvenient for the government for us to have them. Now, very briefly, a couple of years ago, I was in France with my girlfriend and my small daughter, and our trip there was made much more difficult, much more worrying, and much more harrowing by a labor strike amongst railroad workers. You can imagine how tempting it was for the government, given that the government controls the police and controls the military, to just order all of the railroad workers back to work, to just force them to end the strike. Do you have the right to go on strike or not? Now, obviously, you're going to mess up the vacations of millions of tourists. You're going to mess up the ability of working people to go to work. Why do you have a constitution? Why do you have civil rights? Why do these things exist? Why do you have these freedoms and these liberties at all times, except precisely when you need them? Why do people say you have the freedom to make this decision for yourself, except when there are actually consequences, when there's risk? This type of question, it's quite a bit more ethically surreal for someone like myself because I'm vegan, because I live always with these ongoing debates in which meat eaters begin and end their train of thought with the claim that this is just a personal choice, that they have the right, they have the freedom, they have the civil liberty to make this decision for themselves. And they do. But of course, they can't be responsible for the consequences. What if we were to do the calculations? Just whip out a blank sheet of paper and try to calculate how many lives will be saved this year by depriving everyone in France of their civil liberties. And let's be specific, depriving them of the ability to take a walk in the park. All right? How many lives are saved by specifically the restrictions on your ability to walk outdoors? There are many other restrictions, there are many other interventions that might save more lives, like closing down all the restaurants. It's transmitted the same way the common cold is transmitted. So buying food at a restaurant is a much more high-risk activity than taking a walk in the park. You didn't see the person who prepared or handled your food. They may have coronavirus, they may have it, and they may not know that they have it. So you can get sick by eating packaged food at a takeout food from a restaurant or packaged food from a grocery store, any kind of prepared food, anything that's been handled by human hands, right? What if we were to try to estimate how many lives were sold? What if we were to try to estimate how many lives were saved by taking away this civil liberty from you, that you could walk in the park, compared to compelling the whole population to strictly adhere to a vegan diet? If saving lives justifies taking away your civil liberties, if saving lives justifies snuffing out your constitution, your democracy, and replacing it with dictatorship, then the case for veganism would justify the worst tyranny and the worst dictatorship in the history of the world 100 times over, right? Veganism, you're going to be calculating saving lives not only in terms of heart disease, heart attacks, cancer, right? These kinds of direct health impacts on the body through diet. You're also going to be saving lives by reducing the number of people who are getting parasites, bacteria, and viruses from handling raw meat, eating raw meat. As you know, whether it's raw beef, raw chicken, raw fish, all of these things carry disease. So you could pretty quickly come up with calculations for just the amount of human lives, the amount of human misery that would be improved, saved, alleviated through compulsory veganism. This is without even calculating the unbelievable consequences for animal misery, right? Suffering, torture, and death of animals, calculating air pollution, water pollution, knock-on consequences for the planet, which are mind-blowing and astronomical. Okay? So if you want a justification for dictatorship, if you want a justification for taking away people's civil liberties, we have two really strange examples before our eyes right now. One being the ongoing history of hysteria over coronavirus, and the other being the specter of vegan totalitarianism. I had a question come in from a member of the audience who was asking me, this person is well-intentioned, but let's face it, it's a stupid question. Quote, oh great, this scrolled away. What do you think is the most effective and fastest strategy to create a vegan society that includes the abolition of the whole of animal farming, animal slaughter, animal agriculture, the legal exclusion of all animal exploitation, and at the same time ends racism and sexism? Okay. At different times in the history of the world, eccentric people become dictators and tyrants. It still happens to this day. And often enough, those people are still nominally elected. They still have some claim on paper to being part of a parliamentary system or a democracy. Okay, this is going to continue to happen in the future. And if you just try to do a Google search right now and ask the question of Google, how many countries around the world are dictatorships right now? How many countries are ruled by a dictator? It's actually quite difficult to answer. Very quickly, you get into questions of, well, how do you define a dictatorship? But it is inevitable now, say looking ahead at the next 300 years, that somewhere, sooner or later, there will be a dictator, whether it's in Africa or South America or in Asia, who happens to be vegan. Probably somewhere, sooner or later, there will be an experiment in the government coercing people to be vegan. And when we think about this, it puts it into a very different, less comedic perspective. Suddenly we get into really bleak questions, such as I've just been asking about the coronavirus. What do civil liberties mean? What is the significance of someone becoming vegan if they're doing it just because they're forced to by an authoritarian regime? Is that still the outcome you want? Or are you someone who values democracy and the process of public education so highly that you'd rather have maybe a decades-long, very inefficient process of trying to mobilize and motivate people to do the right things for the right reason, trying to engage with people and motivate them to be vegan for the right reason, as opposed to seeing what happens when you have a tyrannical dictatorship and the tyrant in charge happens to be vegan. Very brief example of this, by the way. One of the things that is least remembered about Adolf Hitler was that he was opposed to cigarette smoking. So his regime, it was especially interested in preventing women from smoking cigarettes. It was especially interested in preventing pregnant women from smoking cigarettes. He had his own bizarre, pseudo-evolutionary, social Darwinist reasons for why he was so opposed to cigarette smoking. He didn't want this to lead to the degeneration of the German people. Use your imagination a bit here. You can imagine the rhetoric, I think. In any case, and as soon as West Germany was conquered by the Americans, they instead celebrated their return liberty by handing out packs of cigarettes to everyone, right? So under the American model, for one thing, the American government wanted to actively promote the idea of Germans becoming consumers, buying tobacco exported from America to Germany. There was a straight-up profit motive involved. But this was also a symbol of the type of civil liberty that allegedly the American style of government enshrined. That even if there was very clearly just one correct answer to a question, like it's not the case that for some people smoking cigarettes is the right decision and for some people it's the wrong decision. For absolutely everybody, it's a terrible decision to smoke cigarettes. The right decision for each and every one of us individually is to quit smoking or never smoke at all, and the right decision for our society as a whole is to absolutely abolish smoking. But nevertheless, we value this matter of personal choice and personal responsibility so highly that we would prefer to engage in a decades-long, slow-motion struggle of public education and democratically try to motivate people to make the right choice including, by the way, pregnant mothers, right? Pregnant mothers still have the civil right, they have the civil liberty to smoke during pregnancy. They still even have the right to drink alcohol during pregnancy, right? We don't compel them not to. We don't use the powers of the state. We don't use the military and the police to prevent that. I mean, think about how high the stakes are there. Think about how terrible the consequences are for allowing a woman to drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes during pregnancy. But we allow it, right? Meanwhile, if I were in France right now, I literally would not have the civil right to take a walk in the park. That's been stripped away. What does their constitution mean? What does their whole tradition of so-called freedom and democracy, going back to the French Revolution, mean if I can't take a walk in the park more than 1 kilometer from my house? I can't drive my car on the highway. Talk about social distancing. I mean, just the act of driving inside a car, the idea that this is a risk. And again, let's repeat, the risk is not the same for everyone. This isn't like smoking cigarettes. This isn't like drinking alcohol during pregnancy, right? For me personally, there may be no risk at all walking in the park. I can't transmit the disease. I don't have the disease. I already had it and recovered. I'm immune to the disease. For someone else who's an elderly person, the risk might be more considerable. So you could say that this isn't something that in a simple way reflects one answer for everyone. It's convenient for the state. It's convenient for the government to pretend that there's only one answer for everyone, to enforce one iron rule on everyone, right? But there's actually a really good argument here with coronavirus that morally the right thing to do is to allow each individual to make an informed choice for his or herself. To say, hey, look, we're going to do a public education campaign and tell you what the right choice is, but then we're going to let you decide. The same way we let you decide to smoke cigarettes, the same way we let you decide to eat meat, we value you making the right decision. And if some people make the wrong decision, that's going to have negative consequences for others, right? And yet we tolerate this on a massive scale, day after day after day, with tens of millions of cows being fed, bred, raised in captivity, and slaughtered with disastrous consequences, not only for ecology, not only for the suffering and misery of the animals themselves, but also with a body count in human lives. Okay? So what is the meaning of freedom? Why is it that you always have your freedom except when you need it? What is the meaning of civil liberties if you can't make these decisions for yourself when there are some risks, when there are some actual consequences? I think the people of France, if they're not asleep, I think they need to blow the dust off their constitution and really ask themselves some very hard questions after coronavirus. Because whether they value their civil liberties or not, whether they value their human rights or not, they just experience what it's like to have all of them taken away. And if you'll do it over a disease that is transmitted in the same way as the common cold, do you think the government won't do it over striking railroad workers or any other example you can possibly think of, right? I'm 41 years old. I'm a lot less optimistic about human nature than I was at 21 years old. And I thought of myself as having a tremendously cynical, nihilistic, and ashen perspective on human nature when I was 21, but I had a lot more disappointments coming to me, okay? I'm currently reading the autobiography of Napoleon's younger brother. I'm halfway through the book. Allegedly, Napoleon's younger brother supported his career up to a certain point and then broke away and rebelled against him when it was clear that Napoleon was no longer leading a democracy. He was no longer the first consul in a somewhat democratic electoral parliamentary system, that Napoleon was becoming an outright dictator. That Napoleon's younger brother had more fealty to the idea of a constitutional republic or democracy, or if you want to put it, than he had to his own brother. That this crossed the line, that he wouldn't support Napoleon as Napoleon became an emperor. Okay? Allegedly. I'm reading the book because I want to find out if this is really true. I don't know. Maybe this is a mythology other people made up about the younger brother. Maybe that's not really what happened. We'll see. Okay? I've got to ask myself at age 41, how deep is my commitment to democracy when the vast majority of people are wrong? When it's a simple matter and we know. I mean, coronavirus, I've just said, is not that simple. You could write really complex legislation and say, okay, people who already had the disease and recovered are in this category. People who are elderly and infirm are in this category. Maybe there are some people who get to make this decision for this. You could write something much more nuanced, right? But Coronavirus is not as simple as cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking is bad for everyone. It's not as simple as gambling. Gambling is bad for everyone, all right? It's not as simple as eating meat, drinking dairy, production of leather, etc., right? There's some of these questions that are so ethically simple that the implications are horrifying. And as I say, sooner or later, whether it's in Sri Lanka or Vietnam or some province of India or in South America or in Africa, sooner or later some dictator somewhere is going to take the open question of how to efficiently create a vegan society, and they're going to try to do it with brutal efficiency. Okay? We all have to ask ourselves, how much do we value democracy when the majority of people are wrong? How much do we value civil liberties, the right of the individual to make their own choices, to make their own decisions, when we know the vast majority of those people will make a decision that's clearly wrong, when we know that individuals are going to make a choice that is not just going to harm themselves, it's going to harm others. It's going to have terrible consequences for that society as a whole.